One of the biggest celebrities in contemporary Hollywood was Robert Redford. The 89-year-old actor passed away at his Utah home early this morning. That's what his PR says. Beyond just movies, some Hollywood icons leave behind more. Even when the curtain comes down, the stories, rivalries, and secrets they leave behind endure. The world was shocked by Robert Redford's death, but the rumors that circulated were more loud than the memorials. Beneath the gleaming image and well-groomed grin was a guy with rivalries that molded his entire career, broken friendships, and unhealed grudges. A figure who is so strong and memorable but who is also quite unlikely to pay his final respects to Redford is one name that sticks out. What, even in the end, could have kept two Hollywood icons so far apart? Robert Redford's last moments. On September 16, 2025, the devastating news of Robert Redford's death sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. Across the globe, viewers took a moment to honor a man who had defined American filmmaking for almost 60 years. One of the few performers whose career focused as much on substance as on celebrity was Redford. In addition to being an Oscar-winning director and box office attraction, he founded the Sundance Institute, which permanently altered the course of independent cinema. However, many were compelled to consider the more subdued aspects of his last years and how he had progressively faded from the public eye long before his passing as the tributes came flooding in. In 2018, the pivotal moment occurred. When Redford at last discussed retirement candidly. He had made hints that he might leave for years. However, he acknowledged in an interview advertising The Old Man and the Gun that the movie would be the last one he would do as an actor. The film, in which he portrayed an elderly bank robber who, despite his advanced age, was unable to give up on his love, turned out to be a surprisingly accurate representation of his own path. "I think it's time to move towards retirement and spend more time with my wife and family now that I'm in my 80s, Redford told the Associated Press at the time. Even after the announcement, Redford couldn't leave the scene without spending one more second on screen. Alexander Pierce, a character he had established in Captain America, the Winter Soldier, made a reappearance in Avengers Endgame in 2019. It was a fleeting appearance, but it was important. Many were taken aback by Redford's choice to join the Marvel series, as he had established his career on character-driven narratives and difficult dramas. However, he clarified that his goal was to experience the new techniques and technology being employed in popular movies. That little sequence served as the symbolic end to an incredible cinematic career. The Russo brothers, who directed Endgame, later disclosed that Redford told them the day of filming would be his last day of acting ever. Redford turned his attention even more away from Hollywood in the ensuing years. He sold his Utah horse ranch, which he had held for many years, in 2020. He was able to focus on his Provo Canyon house and his Sundance property, which were essential to his identity outside of acting, thanks to the sale. He resided in Utah, but it was more than that. He had established Sundance as a cultural institution there. That has provided initial opportunities for innumerable filmmakers. Robert's last years were slower paced and spent in nature and with family. His time was mostly devoted to his long-standing interests in painting, art, and environmental conservation. In an atmosphere that focused more on art and nature than on Hollywood or celebrity, he enjoyed peaceful days with his wife, Sybil Zagers, and stayed close to his kids and grandkids. Despite his retirement from prominent roles, Redford maintained a connection to narrative. He kept up his behind-the-scenes job as a producer and was a key player in the 2022 premiere of the AMC series Dark Winds. He made a brief on-screen appearance in the second season of the show in 2025, a modest role that was significant due to its rarity. It turned out to be his last show. His life had been spent according to his own terms, and it came to an end when he passed away quietly at his Sundance home. His effect was widespread, as seen by the tributes that followed. Fans recalled the enduring characters he created, while actors, directors, and producers credited Sundance with helping them launch their careers. Redford's passing, however, further highlighted his contentious reputation despite the mostly positive reviews. This had frequently resulted in disputes in Hollywood. Along the way, Redford had disagreements with some of the biggest names in the industry, but he had also worked with many of them. Additionally, rumors regarding who might or might not attend his funeral have been influenced by these disputes. Although Redford's last years may have appeared serene, his life had always been molded by intense personal adversity. He struggled with disease, grief, and heartbreak long before the world hailed him as a cinematic star. Events that shaped his decisions in private and on film. Robert Redford had a difficult life, which started when he was diagnosed with a minor case of polio, a disease that at the time terrified parents all over America. Even though he eventually healed and his condition was not as bad as many others, the incident made him face fragility at an early age. Additionally, it made him feel more vulnerable than most kids his age have ever had to. He would silently carry this early understanding of how easily stability and health could vanish with him for the rest of his life. After the agony of childhood illness, he experienced something far more heartbreaking as a teenager. Redford's mother, Martha, passed away in 1955 when he was just 18 years old as a result of problems during childbirth. He was forever changed by the loss of a parent at such a critical juncture. And he frequently referred to her passing as the most agonizing experience of his early years. Because of the loss, he had to live with a persistent sensation of absence as he approached adulthood. Additionally, it made him deal with obligations and feelings that most young men his age were unprepared for. The experience of losing her provided him a gravity that he carried even when the world saw him as a golden boy on television, which also helped to add to the introspective attitude that people would later observe in him. Redford's home life in Van Nuys, California, got increasingly complex with the death of his mother. He was raised in a working-class neighborhood, and although he was surrounded by people, he frequently felt alone. Later on, he acknowledged that he was a reclusive young man who preferred to be by himself rather than in big gatherings. All during his early years, that feeling of isolation pervaded everything. It appeared as though a fresh and brighter chapter in his life was beginning when he married historian Lola Van Wagenen in 1958, but tragedy struck again almost soon. Scott, their first son, passed away from sudden infant death syndrome at the age of 10 weeks. The young couple was heartbroken by the tragedy, and although Redford rarely discussed it in interviews, the pain never really went away. He gained a deeper awareness of fragility in family life as a result of the agony of losing Scott. Additionally, it strengthened his resolve to keep his values safe from outside interference. Shauna, James, and Amy are the 3 additional children that Robert and Lola had. Additionally, their marriage provided him with a solid base upon which to build his career for many years. Decades later, however, the specter of loss reappeared with a heaviness reminiscent of his first tragedies. James, his kid, had a rare liver illness for a long time, needed 2 transplants to survive, and had significant health issues for the most of his life. James made a name for himself as a filmmaker and activist in spite of his sickness, frequently pursuing endeavors that mirrored his interests in social justice and the environment. However, bile duct cancer, a consequence of James's prior health issues, ultimately claimed his life in 2020 at the age of 58. Redford, who was 84 at the time, publicly acknowledged his heartbreak. Even a man of Redford's fortitude had to bear the burden of losing 2 children at various points in his life, as the sadness of losing one kid never goes away. However, Redford faced other personal struggles in addition to these catastrophes. After over 30 years of marriage, he and Lola got divorced in 1985. Redford refrained from fostering conjecture regarding the causes of their split. Refused to make his personal life a source of amusement for other people. He believed that those particulars were not for the general public to know, and his silence on the subject served to further solidify his ingrained practice of keeping his private life private. After living alone for many years, he finally found friendship with Sibyl Zegers, a German artist, whom he married in 2009. Away from the profession that had shaped his career, he and she created a later life focused on art, nature, and seclusion. Redford had no desire to reveal his personal life in order to garner attention or sympathy from the public, in contrast to many other superstars of his generation. He had witnessed too much loss, and he understood that keeping that aspect of his life hidden from the cameras was the best defense for both himself and his loved ones. Redford was never accepted by Hollywood. He never altered who he was to appease the industry since he preferred to do things his own way. However, this led to conflicts that caused some relationships to become strained, even while it made some people adore him. Hollywood versus Redford. Despite being one of the most well-known performers in the world, Robert Redford never felt completely at ease using the Hollywood apparatus. He was uncomfortable with the way the studio system functioned from the beginning of his career, and he never held back in expressing his disapproval. He frequently expressed his distaste for studio politics and the seemingly never-ending bureaucracy that accompanied each endeavor. Redford frequently took the more difficult route, demanding artistic independence even when it created conflict, in contrast to many performers who learned to work inside the system by remaining silent or by making concessions to executives. The Great Gatsby, released in 1974, was one of the first and most well-known instances of this. Redford was chosen to play Jay Gatsby, and although the movie had everything it needed to be a tremendous hit, a well-loved book, an A-list cast, and a large studio, he wasn't happy with the script or the casting choices that were selected for him. He expressed his displeasure with the direction the movie was going in. He ultimately declined to go to the premiere, which was unusual for a celebrity of his caliber at the time and demonstrated just how far he was prepared to go in order to defend his convictions. His relationship with Hollywood was largely characterized by this mindset. He frequently argued with executives about creative freedom and left movies when he didn't think the projects were being managed in a way that he could support. For instance, the studio was left reeling when he allegedly abruptly left a film called Blue. He almost left the movie entirely, citing differences over the plot's development, even while he was already cast as the lead, as in Indecent Proposal. Redford's reputation grew problematic in the eyes of studio executives. Although audiences adored him and he was bankable, he was erratic when it came to completing assignments. Hollywood executives and co-workers frequently grumbled that he had another annoying habit. He had a reputation for arriving late to meetings or often missing them completely. This could have hurt the careers of many performers, but Redford was hard to ignore because of his skill, popularity at the box office, and expanding impact as an activist and filmmaker. Even if he wasn't the most easy star to work with, he had gained enough respect and authority that others still wanted him on their projects, so he could afford to take chances with his career. Redford, however, did not consider this conduct to be rebellion in and of itself. He sincerely disapproved of Hollywood's focus on profits and censorship of creativity. Because he thought that in order for filmmakers to produce work on their own terms, they required a different setting. The establishment of the Sundance Institute and the Sundance Film Festival, two of his most significant contributions to the business, resulted from this conviction. Redford envisioned Sundance as a refuge for independent filmmakers who were having difficulty making a name for themselves in a huge studio-dominated field. He provided the means for up-and-coming filmmakers and authors to share their stories without diluting them for profit. It is impossible to overestimate Sundance's influence. There, filmmakers like Ryan Coogler, Chloe Zhao, Quentin Tarantino, and innumerable others initially attracted notice, utilizing the festival as a springboard for careers that would ultimately transform Hollywood. Redford saw Sundance as more than just a movie festival. It served as a direct opposition to the commercialism of Hollywood. It embodied the kind of film he supported. One that eschewed safe, dependable blockbusters in favor of fresh voices and daring concepts. Redford was not just an independent filmmaker. At a time when many celebrities remained silent out of concern about offending fans, he was also vocal on social and political concerns. He frequently included environmental, Native American, and queer community causes into the projects he supported, using his notoriety to further these causes. In addition to being enjoyable political dramas, movies like The Candidate and All the President's Men mirrored his personal convictions about challenging authority and holding strong institutions responsible. Redford saw activism and art as inextricably linked. They were linked, and he promoted causes close to his heart by using Hollywood's influence. Naturally, he didn't always make friends because of his outspoken personality and inability to follow Hollywood conventions. Throughout his career, there were rumors that he refused to collaborate with specific directors or actors again due to personal or professional issues. Despite being loyal to himself, he never publicly discussed these disagreements. He felt that feuds were less effective than silence. Therefore, even though he had strong feelings on those with whom he disagreed, he refrained from making headlines out of them. Because co-workers never fully understood his thoughts, he was both revered and enigmatic. However, they were aware of their position with him in the event that they had collaborated and failed to gain his confidence. His biggest successes and his most tense relationships were both the result of his individualism and unwavering defiance of Hollywood convention. For every admirer who praised him for being authentic, there were those who thought he was challenging, unyielding, or even conceited. Redford, meanwhile, was not contributing. He conducted his professional life in the same manner as his personal life, by establishing clear limits and upholding his values at all costs. Furthermore, even though Redford hardly ever mentioned specific people in his disputes, there were a few business partnerships that ended so abruptly that it was hard to overlook. In one instance, Redford's early career was defined by the words of one of the most significant screenwriters of the 20th century. However, their consequences demonstrated that ego, control, and Hollywood politics could overcome even collaborations based on genius. The consequences involving William Goldman. It is impossible to overlook the influence scriptwriter William Goldman had on Robert Redford's career while discussing it. One of Hollywood's most renowned screenwriters, Goldman's work defined entire cinematic eras. He was the creative force behind The Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy, the film that permanently linked Redford's name to the Sundance identity in addition to giving him his breakthrough role. Goldman would go on to compose a number of other successful works, winning 2 Academy Awards for screenwriting in the process and becoming known as one of the most incisive and significant writers the industry had ever seen. When Redford and Goldman first started working together, it seemed like the ideal combination. Goldman had clever dialogue and a well-developed plot. Redford, meanwhile, contributed charisma, star power, and a keen understanding of how characters need to be portrayed on screen. They collaborated to produce iconic moments in cinema history. Beneath the success, however, were creative disagreements that would eventually lead to one of Redford's most agonizing professional splits. The turning point was when All the President's Men, the 1976 movie based on Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's Watergate investigation, was being made. Redford put a lot of effort into this project. He had purchased the book's rights himself. In addition to being the film's producer, he played Woodward in it. This was more than just another film to him. It made a statement about power, truth, and media. He therefore wanted everything to be perfect, including the screenplay and the performers. When William Goldman was hired to write the script, it seemed like the ideal fit. Goldman, who was well known for transforming challenging material into gripping drama, had just won an Oscar for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. However, Redford and director Alan Pakula were more and more irritated with Goldman's drafts as the filming progressed. They felt that the script lacked the unvarnished detail of investigative reporting that the story required and was overly stylized. Redford then stated that he and Pakula ultimately rewrote a significant portion of the movie themselves, preserving only roughly 10% of Goldman's initial script. Goldman was deeply affected by Redford's public speech. Hearing that his contribution to Redford's career had been reduced to nearly nothing felt like a betrayal to a writer who took such pride in his work and had already accomplished so much. Goldman was upset that Redford would so drastically minimize his involvement, and he maintained that even after changes were made, his work remained at the core of the movie. Goldman won the Academy Award for Best Screenplay for All the President's Men in spite of the conflict. However, the triumph was not straightforward. Questions about how much of the finished movie actually came from Goldman's pen were rife behind the scenes. After looking over drafts and changes, the Writers Guild of America investigated the situation and decided that Goldman should be given credit as the screenplay's only author. It was a formal recognition that Goldman's work was still essential to the movie, even in spite of what Redford and Pakula had said. The incident left Goldman with wounds that never completely went away. He believed that Redford had attempted to downplay his contribution to one of the most significant projects of his career and that their once promising creative collaboration had fallen apart due to control and ego. The two men never made up in public, and their cooperation essentially came to a stop there, even if they went on to work on other projects. While Goldman, who had put his all into the writing, carried the grudge for years, Redford, who valued loyalty and long-term relationships, appeared to tolerate the distance. Many people still reflect on the episode and speculate about what may have transpired if Redford and Goldman had been able to maintain their professional connection. Could they have collaborated on other films that were on par with Butch Cassidy and the President's Men? Or, considering Redford's steadfastness in molding his projects to his exact specifications, was the rupture unavoidable? After their breakup, Redford never talked about Goldman in detail, and Goldman himself kept his displeasure inside, allowing the wound to remain unhealed. There are many failed collaborations in Hollywood, but this one was particularly noteworthy since it involved two people who had previously influenced one another's work. One of Redford's most significant creative partnerships came to an end as a result of their split, which also once again demonstrated how complex his relationship with Hollywood was. It wouldn't be the last time, either, that Redford would clash with another industry titan. Another actor with equal strength, influence, and a resolute sense of self. Worth, William Goldman, would eventually fall victim to Redford's stubbornness. Jack Nicholson versus Robert Redford. Comparisons and rivalry are nearly unavoidable when two of Hollywood's top names emerge simultaneously. Both Jack Nicholson and Robert Redford were born in the 1930s. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, both rose to prominence. Additionally, each came to symbolize quite different facets of American filmmaking. The blonde, attractive, and well-groomed golden boy, Redford was frequently portrayed as the quintessential American hero. In contrast, Nicholson projected grit and unpredictability in almost every character, bringing a darker, more rebellious energy. Although they never publicly quarreled, they were rarely seen as friends, and Hollywood insiders frequently discussed their covert rivalry. In some pivotal instances, particularly in relation to The Great Gatsby, the disparities between the two men were shown. Many well-known people were considered for the lead part in The Great Gatsby when it was being developed by Paramount Pictures in the early 1970s. Among them was the name of Jack Nicholson. One of the most sought-after parts of the decade was playing Jay Gatsby, which offered the opportunity to play one of the most recognizable figures in literature. In the end, Robert Redford, who was enjoying the popularity of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, was cast in the part. However, the casting did not convince Nicholson. According to reports, he thought Redford's image was too pristine and affluent, and too well-groomed to represent the ambitious, troubled driver that F. invented by Scott Fitzgerald in the book. According to him, Gatsby was a man who had endured hardship and despair, and who amassed a wealth out of a restless ambition to rise rather than privilege. In contrast to Redford, Nicholson thought he could give the character that rawness. It was no secret that Nicholson had doubts about Redford playing the part. Later on, he would comment that Redford appeared to be a privileged individual, stating that Gatsby would not be concerned about chopping his way to the top as a character. Redford didn't have Gatsby's edge, hunger, or tumultuous past, in Nicholson's opinion. It was a direct declaration of how differently the two men viewed the same character, not a slight on Redford's skill. Nicholson's remarks made an impression. Redford has always been mindful of his public image, carefully selecting his remarks and steering clear of needless controversy. But Nicholson was blunter and frequently unvarnished. In addition to making their disagreements public, Nicholson's doubts about Redford's appropriateness for Gatsby fueled the idea that the two actors had a suspicious relationship. Since he never played the role, Nicholson's conviction that he could have given Gatsby greater nuance was never put to the test. However, the notion persisted in discussions in Hollywood. Redford starred in the 1974 adaptation of The Great Gatsby, but it was not the box office hit the studio had hoped for. The picture received mediocre reviews, with reviewers frequently criticizing its lack of emotional depth and shiny exterior. It seemed as if Nicholson had foreseen the exact reason why the movie would falter in his remarks. Redford and Nicholson, however, were circling the same roles outside of the Gatsby epic. Both were once considered for the role of the Godfather's Michael Corleone. Al Pacino ultimately won the part, and his gloomy intensity changed the expectations of viewers for a mafia tale. Another example was The Sting, one of Redford's most cherished films from 1973. The part of Johnny Hooker, the young scammer who co-stars with Paul Newman's character in the narrative, had been offered to Nicholson. However, Nicholson declined it. Chose to concentrate on initiatives like Chinatown instead, which he felt provided greater intricacy. Both men benefited from the choice, as Nicholson gave one of the most acclaimed performances of the decade in Chinatown while Redford scored one of his biggest hits. However, the overlap strengthened the impression that, whether they acknowledged it or not, they were frequently working in the same field, selecting from the same pool of well-known screenplays, and comparing themselves to one another. Redford and Nicholson never collaborated on a movie in spite of everything. This absence says a lot for two celebrities of their caliber. Hollywood frequently teams up opposing stars to increase box office receipts or to build tension on film, although this never happened in this instance. Different theories explain why. While some claim Redford tended to keep his projects under strict supervision and might not have wanted to share the limelight with someone as dominant as Nicholson, others contend Nicholson saw no benefit in collaborating with Redford. Redford's relationship with Nicholson, in contrast to his rupture with William Goldman, never burst into outright animosity, but there was tension there, woven within Nicholson's remarks, the parts they shared, and the professional quiet that separated them. This rivalry largely stayed hidden from the public, evident only in the sporadic quotation or the hypothetical situations regarding the roles they both could have performed. However, it gave Redford's complex relationship with Hollywood a new dimension. He was a man who aroused both awe and suspicion. Although he had talent, he was occasionally overly meticulous, controlled, and polished. In your opinion, what other actor did Robert Redford have problems with? Tell us in the space provided for comments below. If you liked this video, please remember to subscribe to our channel for future updates and click on the next video that appears on your screen.